My daughter Lucy and I love to go to the movies. Unfortunately, all she wants to see these days are horror movies, which give me nightmares. But when she was younger, it was all Disney Pixar. Sometimes I think we've seen every film created since the Disney Renaissance began in 1989. Over the years, I've noticed one of the surprising and yet prevalent themes that recurs in these movies is the veneration of ancestors. From The Lion King to Pocahontas, Mulan, Brother Bear, Moana, Coco, to Turning Red, ancestor veneration has been a common part of these animated storylines for over 30 years, especially when Disney Pixar is trying to tell a story from an African, Asian, Native American, Polynesian, or Latinx culture. One of the films that depict the veneration of ancestors, Coco, stands apart for how critical it is to the plot of the story. Set in the small Mexican town on the week leading up to Dia de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead, as families gather to remember and pay respects to those who've died, the story focuses on Miguel de la Cruz, an energetic child from a lower-class family of shoemakers. Miguel rejects his family's business because of a secret desire to play guitar and sing like his idol, the famed musician Ernesto de la Cruz. This is blasphemy to his grandmother, whose grandfather abandoned the family to pursue a musical career. But when he knocks over a picture on the family ofrenda, Miguel discovers that the great Ernesto de la Cruz may have been his great-grandfather. And so on Dia de los Muertos, he steals de la Cruz's famous guitar and is accidentally transported into the spirit world. There he finds the souls of the departed live in peace and happiness, so long as they are remembered by their family. But if they are forgotten by their families, they disappear forever. It's the perfect All Hallows Eve, All Saints Day movie, which is no surprise since the Day of the Dead is a combination of indigenous Mexican and Christian cultures. And the song that holds the story together has these beautiful words: remember me, though I have to say goodbye, remember me. Don't let it make you cry. Forever if I'm far away, I hold you in my heart. I sing a secret song to you each night we are apart. Remember me, though I have to travel far. Remember me, each time you hear a sad guitar. Know that I am with you the only way that I can be, until you're in my arms again. Remember me. There is something profoundly spiritual about remembering the dead. And while I love the costumes and candy and trick-or-treating and parties on Halloween, it would be a shame if we neglected the original reason for this holiday. Our ancestors are still with us in the only way that they can be. And we are called not only to remember and to venerate them, but to commune with them as well. I think Disney Pixar is trying to tell us that we have a lot to learn from immigrants in America about the veneration of our ancestors. For one thing, it teaches us we are not alone. The Surgeon General has said we are experiencing an epidemic of loneliness, isolation, and disconnection that is having a devastating impact on our mental, physical, and social health. And it could be argued that the reason we feel so lonely is that we miss our ancestors. Somehow we've lost touch with them. We've detached from them. We've forgotten them. And I'd be willing to bet that very few of us created an altar to our deceased ancestors when we put up our Halloween decorations this year. And this absence of connection to our ancestors in our lives is why the writer Steve Crandrell believes that the West, and Americans more intensely, are suffering from ADD, ancestor deficit disorder, which he claims is a spiritual epidemic. Crandall writes, "A tree without roots cannot grow. When we lose our roots, we too begin to wither, losing our balance, emotional health, and spiritual foundation. Ancestor deficit disorder, according to Transcends, causes anxiety, a lack of wonder, loss of individual destiny, chronic cynicism, low levels of gratitude, spiritual withdrawal, emotional resignation, disconnection of heart and mind, loss of faith, atrophy of joy. He claims that we need to remember, to give thanks, to connect with our ancestors for friendship, for that sense of family, for love, for guidance, for support, so that we can cope with all the difficulty and disappointment that we are facing in our lives, to grieve our losses in community with them, and to try and find our equilibrium. To bring it home, Crandall quotes from an African shaman from Swaziland who once said, "Tell those in the West that they have lost their way. They need to know that the cause of many of their problems is the neglect of ancestral spirits." Now, while I cannot ensure that you will go home today and build an ofrenda to your deceased relatives, I can invite you to reflect on the story of one of Jesus' ancestors, a woman named Ruth. Her story takes place in the time of the Judges, the most disruptive period in the history of Israel, and it begins the way that many immigrant stories begin, with a great famine causing a mass shortage of food and water and jobs and economic precarity that forces a woman named Naomi and her husband Elimelech to leave their hometown of Bethlehem and to migrate into enemy territory, into the land of Moab with their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Their names mean sickness and annihilation, which symbolically foreshadows the tragedy that will befall their family. Elimelech dies first, leaving Naomi a widow. Her sons then marry two Moabite women, already controversial in and of itself, Ruth and Orpah. But then her sons die as well, leaving Naomi a childless widow with no means of security in a harsh and dangerous and patriarchal world. Eventually, Naomi hears that there is food back in her hometown of Bethlehem again and makes a plan to return home. But before leaving, she gives her daughter-in-laws a blessing. She prays over them, "May God deal kindly with you as you have dealt kindly with the dead and with me. May you return to your mother's house. May the Lord grant you a husband, and may you find peace and security there." Then she kisses them, and they weep aloud together. And at first, Ruth and Orpah refuse to leave Naomi. Eventually, though, Orpah, whose name means back of the neck, kisses Naomi goodbye and turns to go back home to her people and her gods. But Ruth, on the other hand, clings to her mother-in-law like a spouse and makes a sacred and solemn vow to her, one of the most beautiful vows in all of Scripture. "Do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die also. There I will be buried. May the Lord do this and so to me, if even death parts me from you." While the story of Ruth is set in the time of the Judges, it was an oral tradition passed down through the centuries. And scholars tell us that the story wasn't actually written down officially until the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is fascinating because that is an era of widespread xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment. Ruth was written after the return of exile, at a time when the new judges ruled over Israel, new judges who forbid the Jewish people from marrying foreigners, and deporting immigrants from Jerusalem was commonplace. So the old story of Ruth, which predated the Davidic monarchy, was written down as a countercultural testimony, an alternative witness to challenge the xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment of the current time. Ruth was written to remind people of a time when the extraordinary faith and love of an immigrant woman from Moab saved Naomi and her people from annihilation. The Israelites and the Moabites, for those who aren't familiar, originated from the same family, had ancestors in common, descended from two brothers, Abraham and Lot. Yet Deuteronomy 23 explicitly states that Moabites should never be included in the community. They were Israel's most hated enemies. And then along came the story of Ruth to challenge that exclusionary sentiment that was written into the Jewish law itself. Ruth's decision To stay with Naomi exemplifies an extravagant kind of compassion for the sake of another person. She gave up the security of her country, her parents, her family, her home, her land, her ancestors, her gods, even her future, to take Naomi as her own family, as her home, and to adopt Naomi's land and Naomi's ancestors and Naomi's gods as her own. Ruth promised that she would die by whatever means Naomi dies, even if that was stoning or burning or decapitation or hanging. And Ruth vowed that she would be buried in the same ground and in the same grave as Naomi. Even more, Ruth pledged that when Naomi is no longer living, when Naomi is gone, she would not return home to Moab, but will stay in Israel forever. When we unite ourselves in love and marriage and family and friendship or community with another person or people, we unite ourselves with their ancestors as well. Our ofrenda gets larger as we radically expand the great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us and supports us so we can run the race of life with resilience and perseverance. Ruth's faith and love for Naomi, her people, her land, her ancestors, and her God is described with a very special Hebrew word that is almost always reserved for God, and that word is Hessed, which is often poorly translated in our Bibles as loving kindness. Hesed is impossibly difficult to say in English because it contains so many different aspects in one word. It describes a love that goes beyond anything that could be expected, beyond any application of the law, beyond any duty or beyond any obligation. And Hesed is also loyalty and fidelity that is steadfast, faithful, and true, and that is based on an ardent promise, agreement, or vow or covenant like the one that Ruth made to Naomi. But Hesed not only refers to this deep sense of love and loyalty, but also the compassionate behaviors of mercy that it inspires. Hesed is about both belief and action, being and doing, feeling and living. And this is why Micah 6:8 is so important to us, because it is really best translated, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to Hesed, and to walk humbly with God? We reduce the power of this scripture when we simply say to love kindness, because the word there is Hesed. The prophet Micah is basically telling us that what the Lord requires of us is to do justice, to love like the immigrant Ruth did, and to walk humbly with God. Can you imagine what it was like to hear this story at a time when anti-immigrant sentiment was at a fever pitch? I believe you can. The story of Ruth was not just a story of a wonderful foreigner who saved Naomi, but also the story of one who came and established the line of David and became the ancestor of Jesus. Her story is a reminder to the people of Israel that there was a time in history when they would not have made it without the immigrant. And it turns out the foreigner is not so foreign after all. They are actually a part of the family. Scholar Judy Frentis Williams says, Ruth is a survival manual for a world divided by identity politics. Through the lens of the post-colonial, Ruth calls us to reconcile our connection to humanity, to focus on what unites us, not what divides us. It reminds us that God is working through people that we deem as the other or less than. And it takes the most hated and rejected and excluded other and makes them a faithful redeemer who exhibits the Hesed of God. Ruth demands that we remember that we are all part of the same human family. Even if our parents are different, we all share the same blood. All our divisions are false. All our compartments and constructions are false. All our borders are made up, and separation is our greatest lie. We live in a time of great disruption and xenophobia, not unlike the time of Judges or the time when Ruth was written. And it would be very easy for us to imagine that the greatest problems that we face in life and in this world are hatred and extremism, partisanship, misinformation, racism, bigotry, nationalism. But the greatest problem we face is division itself, which is not based on the idea that we are diverse and different people, but based on the idea that our diversity and difference fundamentally separate us from each other as human beings. Separation is a lie that keeps families broken, religion violent, politics intractable, nations divided, creation crumbling, and grief hopeless. The reason we suffer so much is because we've come to believe that separation is real and inevitable. But really, Hessed is what exists. Love exists to expose and destroy the lie of separation. And love is the only force that has the power to transcend all our divisions and reveal that we are, in fact, always connected. There's an author, Charles Eisenstein, who writes, "There is a common root underneath all the diverse crises of the modern age. Underlying the vast swath of ruin our civilization has carved is not human nature, but the opposite, humanity denied. The denial of human race rests upon an illusion, a misconception of self and world. We have defined ourselves as other than we are, as discrete subjects, separate from each other and separate from the world around us. Saints and mystics have tried for thousands of years to teach us how we are trapped in this delusion, and yet we think of separation as a good thing, as freedom, as independence, as an ascent in which we have risen above our animal origins. Yet whether it is separation from God or creation, our ancestors, or other people, Eisenstein claims that the ideology of separation has generated the converging crisis in our world today and threatens to destroy us. But separation is an illusion. It is a lie. The reality is we are not actually separate from God or creation or our ancestors or each other at all. We are deeply connected with everyone and everything all the time. What happens to one of us affects the other. As Dr. King said, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. We need each other. We are dependent upon each other. We are not whole without each other, without our neighbors, our ancestors, without God or creation. And Eisenstein suggests that the solution to the lie of separation is the deep medicine of reciprocity and interbeing. The ability to fully embody the reality that we are not independent of one another at all, or our ancestors, or creation, or God, but completely and totally interdependent, cosmically and biologically bound up together, not separate at all, but symbiotic. Luis Urrea was born with tuberculosis in Tijuana, Mexico. His parents believed that he would die if they did not migrate to America. And so, when Luis and his family, when he was young, they migrated. Later, when Luis was 17 and getting ready to go to college, his father, Alberto, returned to his village of Mexico to get money for his son's education, but was tragically murdered. His father's death prompted Luis to write an essay processing his grief that eventually spawned his career as an award-winning poet and novelist. He once wrote this amazing thing about the English language. He said, "English, it's made up of all these untidy words. Have you noticed? Native American, skunk, German, waltz, Danish, twerp, Latin, adolescent, Scottish, feckless, and on and on. It's a glorious wreck," which is a good old Viking word. "Glorious, I say, in all its shambles and mutable beauty. People daily speak a quilt work of words and continents and nations and tribes, and even enemies dance all over your mouth when you speak. Words are the only bread we can really share. When we say we, I mean every one of us," he writes, "everybody, all of you, every border patrol agent and every trembling Mexican peering through the fence. Each confused mother, every disappointed father. For I am nobody's son, but I am everyone's brother. We belong to each other. So come here to me and walk me home." Every American has an immigrant as an ancestor. And so on All Saints' Day, we remember those who have come before us. The community of our ancestors, the great cloud of witnesses that surround us and support us as we live in a dangerous and disruptive time. We can be encouraged by the fact that our ancestors, many of them like the founders of this church, lived through times that were worse than the ones that we live in. and not only survived, but they found a way to thrive. But on All Saints' Day, we also remember that no matter how lonely and divided we feel as Americans today, we are not alone, and we are not separate from one another. We are rooted and grounded in the love of our ancestors, and separation is a terrible lie. There is nothing that can separate us from the love that we call Hessed. Neither life, nor death, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation can separate us from love. There are no borders, no boundaries, no political parties, no ideologies, no nations, no ethnicities, no races, no genders, no abilities, no sexualities, no religions, no classes, no creeds, no denominations, no divisions, no problems, no troubles, no trials, no tribulations that can separate us from love unless we let it. Death cannot even separate us. Love transcends even the grave. We are cosmically connected, universally united, infinitely bound to one another, wonderfully woven together across time and across space. Separation is an illusion. Separation is the lie. And love transcends everything. All we need to do is remember. Amen.